there's an access code up there on top, and if you drop a pin to a place on the Gulf that has a meaningful connection for you, that would be great. In a few minutes, I'm also going to ask you to enter a meaningful memory on Mentimeter for you, from you as well. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, again, the access code, go to Mentimeter or menti.com and use that code, and you can drop a pin. Thank you. All right, folks. Let me make sure that this mic is working. So I'm going to move this forward. Whoever's out down there in Cancun, we hope you had a good time. Whoever's out, dotting the I in the middle of the Gulf, we also hope you had a good time, and that wasn't some kind of difficult story. But I'm going to forward this so you can also share a memory. So if you want to start, the mic up here is working, but if you want to share a memory, again, access code, and you should just be able to type in, and we'll start seeing them. And I can, while it's hard for me to read up there, I do have a 3-year-old's iPad that I can read them off from here. So somewhere a 3-year-old is missing their iPad at the moment. I know which 3-year-old it is. So the mic is now working too, I think, actually. So excellent. So I'm going to do a little bit of intro stuff here while you're doing that. So welcome, everyone. It's great to see such a great turnout when we're fighting bad weather in a presidential debate, although we've got a little bit of time before the presidential debate, so hopefully we can have you out of here and home in time to watch that. I'm Matt Jacobs. I'm director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for our wonderful program. As you're sharing that, your memories, I do want to go through a few thanks. Becca Burton, who's our Gulf Scholars Program Coordinator, has been critical to pulling this off, as has a number of folks on the staff here that are helping out. Our student assistants and our fellows. I particularly want to highlight Isa Garcia, Radhika Subramanian, and Reed Jeffries, who've played specific roles in pulling off tonight's event. We do have a Gulf Scholars Steering Committee, and I'll explain what Gulf Scholars here is in just a few minutes as well. I'm not going to list them all. It's a group of 10 individuals, some of whom are up here on the stage tonight as part of this panel as well. And then the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Again, I'll explain their connection in a couple moments. Within the NASM, the Gulf Scholars Program, which again is administered nationally by them, and then the University of Florida President's Office, which has also provided funding for the larger initiative for which this is the launching event. Before I get to explaining all of that, I do want to talk briefly about the Bob Graham Center for Public Service and the legacy of Bob Graham. Former Governor and Senator Bob Graham founded the center in 2006 to focus on civic engagement, public leadership, and public service, broadly defined. And as part of that, he really believed in learning by doing. And for those of you who are familiar with Bob's story here in Florida as an elected official, he epitomized that learning by doing through his work days. And so as a campaign initiative back in 1977, he launched his work days, not as a photo op, but as a way to learn about the everyday lives of everyday Floridians and what they do and what they were concerned with. So he would do full shifts, whether it was as a public stock boy, working as a lumberjack. One of his favorite stories was to talk about the day he spent driving a cement truck before you had to have specific class license to drive a cement truck. And that he learned from that maybe you should have a specific set of skills to drive a cement truck, and therefore that led him as governor to implement a requirement for different classes of license to drive different sorts of vehicles and so on. But that was central to his founding of the center and his goals for helping students at the University of Florida develop the skills and mindsets necessary for effective civic engagement, public leadership, and public service. Two areas in particular where he was especially interested in that is in community engagement and environmental stewardship. And those are two spaces that connect very much with what we're going to be talking about today. The connections to Gulf Scholars, again, which I'm just about to explain to you, after he had left the Senate in 2004, we had the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. He was named national co-chair of the commission to investigate that and offshore drilling. I actually have that commission report right here. It's actually an autographed version of it with Bob's signature right on the title page there. Why does that matter? Because it's settlement monies from that investigation and from that tragedy that funds what we're going to be talking about tonight and a whole host of other initiatives out there. And so I'll use that then to get into what is the Gulf Scholars Program. So here I'm going to quote directly from the website. The Gulf Scholars Program supports Gulf of Mexico region colleges and universities in preparing undergraduate students as the next generation to address critical challenges in the region related to the focus areas of the Gulf Research Program: community health and resilience, environmental protection and stewardship, and offshore energy safety. Participating schools will engage students from across the sciences, engineering, medicine, humanities, arts, and beyond to develop key competencies and mindsets necessary to address critical Gulf challenges. We are part of the third cohort of the region-wide Gulf Scholars Program. So we just finished our first year of our grant. We received $525,000 in funding from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to support our Gulf Scholars Program. We also received $413,000 in the initial round of UF presidential strategic funding to support this initiative. So over the course of the next 4 years, we have about $900,000 to spend supporting initiatives to get our undergraduate students engaged in our Gulf communities. We'll talk a little bit about what a Gulf community is here in a few moments as well, because we might understand those to mean different things. So that's really, really important, and it's a transformative grant for the Bob Graham Center for Public Service as it connects to the legacy of Bob Graham and who the center is and what we seek to do going forward. What will we do with those monies? We'll support new curricular initiatives. So course development, we're going to be developing either a certificate or minor in Gulf Studies that students can participate in. Student engagement and experiential learning opportunities. So if you want to do research on the Gulf, if you want to try to get a Gulf-related internship, we took 7 students to Pensacola in June to look at, to do oral histories of some communities that were moved and relocated as part of a response to 4 Superfund issues in the late 90s. It remains the 3rd largest community relocation initiative in the U.S. history. And again, that was connected to Superfunds in the Pensacola area. We'll be doing another return trip with oral history in November. Gulf impact projects. If an individual student has something they want to try to research, something they want to try to connect on, we have resources to support that, both through mentorship and financial resources to provide support for that. So all of those things are initiatives that we are launching, and tonight is the launching public program around this, and we're very excited to have it. So before I actually introduce our participants, 2 last very quick things to share. One, we will have a Q&A at the end, so those of you who are here present in Pew Hall will have a mic, but you'll also be able to submit your questions via Mentimeter at the end, so we'll be able to see them up here. For those of you who are watching remotely, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your attendance. And you can also submit your questions through the online portal there. For those of you who are present, we will have a reception to follow upstairs in the O'Neill Reading Room, which is behind you on the 2nd floor, where you can have some opportunities to converse with our panelists. As I said, I'm Matt Jacobs. I'll be the moderator for the evening. We have 4 panelists. I'm going to give very brief introductions because the first question is going to ask them to talk about how they connect with the Gulf and then sort of explain a little bit about how they connect professionally after that. So Jeff Carney is an architect and certified city planner. He's also associate professor in the School of Architecture, director of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience, and director of the Florida Resilient Cities Program. So thank you, Jeff, for participating. Jack Davis is distinguished professor in history and Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities. He's the author or editor of 10 books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea. Thank you, Jack, for being here as well. Christine Angelini is Associate Professor in Environmental Engineering Sciences and Director of the Center for Coastal Solutions here at UF. Thank you, Christine. I will note that Jeff, Jack, and Christine all serve on our Gulf Scholars Steering Committee as well, so thank you for your service on that also. And then Marlowe Starling is a freelance environmental journalist based in Miami and New York City. She received her undergraduate degree here at UF and her master's in science journalism from NYU. Her work has appeared in the National Geographic, the New York Times, the Associated Press, and a number of other entities, including Florida's own the Marjorie, where we have some of the co-founders of the Marjorie here in the audience as well. And then she's currently a Launchpad Fellow with the Safina Center. So thank you, Marlowe, for joining us as well. We're happy to have you here. So I want to start with Jack and ask you to tell us a little, I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal connections to the Gulf. And again, I want to start with Jack Davis here. Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody see what I did?
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for all of you who, as Matt said, braved the weather and came out tonight. It was really coming down a little while ago, but that's Florida, and that's Gulf of Mexico weather. But my connection to the Gulf of Mexico, my personal connection, goes back to my childhood, and I actually traced my literary and scholarly interest to the Gulf to my early years on Santa Rosa Sound in Mary Esther, Florida. Probably nobody knows except for Becca where Mary Esther is. And it was a lonely sort of place, I thought initially, because when we moved there when I was 10, there was no baby boom neighborhood, no kids on bicycles, and so it was just my Springer Spaniel and me and the Sound. And I was fortunate enough to get a boat with a little 6-horse kicker, and I ended up spending all my time on the water. And it turned out to be really an educational place for me, and it always stuck with me. And several years ago, when I was searching around for a new book to write, it occurred to me that I looked at the Gulf of Mexico and I saw a need because nobody had written a book about the Gulf of Mexico, and it's hardly even mentioned in history books, and when it is, it's only mentioned in passing. But also this was around the time of the Gulf oil spill, and of course following Hurricane Katrina. And I felt as though that the people, not just Gulfsiders, but Americans, didn't really know much about this place. I didn't know much about this place. I realized when I started researching and writing my book on the Gulf of Mexico. And so it really, this lifelong relationship with the Gulf blossomed even more so when I began writing this book, because I like to say writing it was truly a labor of love.
And Jack is now working on a history of the American coast, which is the lower 48. He's not got Alaska and the Great Lakes and Hawaii in there, but we get to look forward to learning more about America's coastlines. Christine.
Sure, I thought maybe I'd be the end of the line. Still thinking. So nice to see all of you. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this launch event for the Gulf Scholars Program. Hopefully all of you are an active part of this growing enterprise over the next couple of years. And so maybe you'll be up here as kind of telling the stories of the power of this program. So anyways, really excited to be here, and it's a pleasure to help kick it off. I have a very, different starting and entry point to the Gulf of Mexico than Jack. I was a graduate student here at the University of Florida, and the first thing they do with the incoming graduate students in the biology department is to take them for a weekend trip at Seahorse Key, just off Cedar Key. And I have done work on the coast for several years before this, and I was pretty uninspired by the Gulf, quite honestly. I thought, it was buggy, it was no waves, the tide only goes just a little bit up and down. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know how interesting of a place this really is to study. Fast forward a number of years, I now love going with my kids island hopping around that same area. It's where they really learn to swim. I feel like the wildlife and the biodiversity is amazing, and I'll share more about my professional development later, but my career has been as a coastal ecologist. I do work in coastal marshes and reefs and dunes. Much of my early part of my career was trying to understand why these systems were sort of unraveling, associated with different climate change factors and human development pressures like overfishing. And there's only so long you want to study that before you want to try to figure out how do you counter those changes. And so really the last chapter of my career since I've become a faculty member here at UF in environmental engineering to understand how to put these systems back together, how to make them more stable in the future. And that has led me to running now an interdisciplinary program here where I realized that to fix the nature along our coastline here in the state, it's not just an ecology problem, it's a water problem, it's an infrastructure problem, it's a community problem. And so it really requires the interdisciplinary expertise that sort of is represented by this panel. So look forward to the conversation, and that's about it.
Great, thank you, Christine. Marlowe, do you want to go next?
Okay, can everybody hear me? All right, I'm nervous about these mics. So as Matt said, I'm from Miami, so I did not grow up on the Gulf of Mexico like Jack did. But similar to Christine, my introduction to the Gulf was by way of being a student here in Cynthia Barnett's environmental journalism class, where we also went out to Cedar Key and stayed on Seahorse Key overnight, which was a really cool experience. And that was sort of my introduction to what it means to be an environmental journalist, to the connections that are important for us to understand as science communicators. And that memory still sticks out in my mind because it was so special. I got to share it with some really awesome classmates who now are also doing big, amazing things. And I think back to that often when I'm doing my current reporting. So I'm now based in Brooklyn, but my reporting has expanded beyond Florida, but I still come back to Florida pretty often to report. I can't stay away for too long, which is why I'm still involved with the Marjorie, which you all should check out if you're not familiar with it already. Becca Burton is one of the editors there. And I thought back to that memory recently when I was reporting in Cedar Key for the Marjorie on sharks, stay tuned, and had this memory of being on Cedar Key again and thinking, wow, this feels like a full circle moment. I was here only a few years ago as a student, but this was where I was inspired to pursue this as my career for the foreseeable future. I, of course, went to grad school after I graduated from the University of Florida to continue pursuing science journalism in many different ways, but I think one of the ways that the Gulf is special to me is that it introduced why it's important to connect the dots for readers, which is, my primary goal with my career. So yeah, it's a special place for me as well.
Excellent. And Jeff?
Thank you all for being here. So my journey, I think, started from, I was sitting on the 24th floor of my office building in San Francisco, California, at my corporate architecture firm, designing a train station or a high rise or something like that. And I got a friend of mine from grad school called me and she said, "Hey, we've got this job opening at LSU. You wanna come here?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I have no idea why you're calling me with that question, but it nagged at me for a couple days, and I ended up taking the job sight unseen, having never even been to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because it seemed like a good way to spend a year. And let's say 10 years later, I took this job in the University of Florida, but I was at LSU for 10 years, and what started out as a kind of a creative idea really for me was transformative. I mean, I lived a block from the Mississippi River, and as an architect who I kind of consider my career based on solid things, right? I mean, buildings, they're cities, they're solid, they last. Suddenly to be in a place where the most inspirational thing was the transformational landscape, and being on the Mississippi River, and everything south of Baton Rouge is the Delta, and it just is this incredible history of change. And suddenly being in an environment where what we were doing was working with communities that were adapting, transforming, changing, and that was just what they did. I mean, that you could say that there was this kind of momentary kind of disruption that was happening, but throughout history that had happened. And so thinking and working with communities on sort of how do we work within that sort of paradigm of long-term change. And so moving here to Florida has been a continuation of that real interest in sort of the dynamics and the way we exist in a changing and transforming landscape.
Excellent, thank you. And hopefully you were able to actually come here, visit here first before
I did.
Move from one swamp to another. But yeah, so excellent. So some of you have already touched on this, but I want to give you a chance to fill it out if you wish. Christine, I'll start with Christine. How is that personal connection involved in your professional work specifically, right? And again, some of you have touched on this already, but if you want to fill that out a little bit. Yeah, Christine?
Sure. So as I started to allude to, I wasn't inspired as an ecologist necessarily to work on the Gulf, but when I was tasked by my dean to run this new center to do important things for the coast in the state of Florida, it was coming on right at the same time that red tide was all over the news. The blue-green algae blooms, red tide blooms. It was coinciding with the election for governor, and it became a huge hot-button political topic of what is essentially the state going to do to address its catastrophic water quality challenges. These were the images of slimy-looking water and dead fish and whale sharks washing up on our beaches. And I said, well, if my program is going to be relevant, we are going to work on that problem. And so that brought us to working on red tide and trying to essentially study a long time question that had been really unresolved from a scientific perspective, which is there a role of what's going on land with driving sort of the severity and the duration of red tide blooms that exist along Florida's southwest coast? So if you haven't experienced these blooms, they sort of turn the water a reddish brownish color. They're formed by little microscopic algae called dinoflagellates that can release toxins. And these toxins can both kind of enter the air and sort of come on shore and get blown on shore and affect, people's respiratory health, make your eyes itchy, your skin itchy, but it also kills wildlife as it bioaccumulates. These toxins bioaccumulate through the food web. And so, we set out to answer this question, which had been kind of like, historically, the common parlance is like, probably humans have some sort of connection, but there's no smoking gun about what the connections are between land use change and nutrient pollution coming off the land and how these blooms are forming. And so we assembled a team to study that. David Kaplan is in the audience today. He's still studying the longer term connections of these blooms to human health across Florida's southwest coast and really understanding the land use drivers. But this was like, for me, it was like hitting the bullseye of a sort of environmental challenge facing and affecting, millions of Floridians across Florida's southwest coast. So it's been a sort of pleasure of my career to be able to work at a place like UF where we have the expertise in sort of land use change, in hydrology, in biogeochemistry, in ocean circulation. Those are all the things we need to kind of pull together to understand and answer that fundamental question of, are humans, partly to blame for the severity of these blooms? And so we found that evidence and it became a pretty big story. So
Great.
I'll share there.
Excellent. And I should have also added in, if you want to talk about these notions of resilience and sustainability, I'm going to come back and ask you to define them a little more carefully, but as generic concepts first in your work. You hinted at some of that already, Christine, without using those words. Marlowe, I'll turn it over to you if there's anything you want to add on those, sort of your professional evolution and so on.
Yeah, definitely. So my component follows up well to Christine's because I had the pleasure of reporting on her research that she just described with a group of students that were part of another Cynthia class for a project called Watershed. It was a Pulitzer Center funded project that we worked on, and I was able to report a written story about that research. And I also teamed up with a classmate, Alexandra Harris, to pull in data that was provided by the scientific team themselves to create a visual that made more intuitive sense to someone who is unfamiliar with science so that we could help with that communication component and help connect the dots. Which brings me back to that thing that I said in my former answer about connecting the dots and where my role as a journalist is so important and connects to my connection with the Gulf. I think so many of the issues that I have reported on in the Gulf of Mexico have made it clear to me that our role as journalists specifically is to help people understand how one thing leads to another, not just what the news is, but how does it affect them and what caused that thing to happen in the first place. And so often in mainstream media, I see those links missing, which is a core element of what I try to accomplish with my work. So, it's a really great example, I think, of doing that because, Christine's team broke kind of a revelatory, science on what's influencing the severity of these blooms, and being able to communicate that in a way where, the average person is not picking up Christine's scientific paper and reading it. And so our role is to communicate that in a way that's accessible to people, that's engaging, that is telling a story, but also dispelling misinformation, communicating things accurately and fairly.
Thank you, and we're going to come back to that question of the role of the media and some other institutions too, in an era of declining trust in institutions as well, here in a few minutes. Jeff, do you have anything you want to follow up with on this?
So for me, as an architect, there's this term design thinking, which has always been a sort of a buzzword that we use, and I think over the course of my career, I've discovered the value of that as the teams that I work on get bigger and bigger and more complex and more multidisciplinary. And I'd never worked with a scientist. I'd never worked with a scientist before I went to LSU, and it was fascinating because the range of problem solving, or the problematizing of something, and determining how you solve it. What does a solution even mean? How do you express it to a public? How do you what's the actual box that you're working within? It was so radically different amongst the people we worked with. And so when I was at LSU, I ran a center around coastal sustainability. And when I came here, we started the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience. All of these are extremely multidisciplinary. But so my role as in a sense, the kind of middle of that is almost as the design thinking communicator, and that we think about these problems iteratively. And I think as an architect, on one hand, it's a practice. Someone hires me to build a building, I got to build a building under budget, and it's got to shed water, and it's got to do certain things. At the same time, I have to tell the story of that building. I have to demonstrate to that client who's going to spend all this money why they should spend all that money. I also have my own research agenda. I have the things in the world that I want to build towards. I might not complete it on every project, but I'm going to iteratively make way. And so that's design thinking. It's this iterative move towards solving problems. You often will solve them and then resolve them and resolve them. And so for me, that was the thing that I started to find that was a kind of glue to some of these teams, and it's been really exciting.
I'll just share that 4 of us are working on another large grant proposal at the moment. And this iterative process that you're talking about, I was just having a conversation actually with my wife over the weekend, saying, working with somebody from engineering, working with an architect, working with somebody from journalism on this has really been fascinating. I'm a historian by training myself, and so it's been really fascinating to watch this come together. And we do a lot of interdisciplinary work here in the Graham Center, but from the ground level, and I mean fascinating in the best possible way. It actually has been really interesting, right? So
it's been interesting. It's also, you're uncomfortable at all moments with where the conversation may or may not go. So
yeah.
Are we making progress?
Yeah.
Are we making?
Well, we have a pretty close deadline, so we better make progress, right? But okay, Jack, and I know as I said, the opportunity to talk a little bit about resilience and sustainability as well might come in here.
Now?
Yeah, feel free.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and you can talk more about the professional side too if you wish. But yeah, feel free to tackle this question of resilience and sustainability.
Well, having written this book and having, being part of the Gulf Scholars Program and living with the Gulf the way I have and still do, really, one of the things I was trying to do with the book is encourage. I write for a general audience, not strictly an academic one. I'm not interested in having my books end up on a cold steel shelf of an academic library. No offense to academic libraries, and I think I'm going to be offending a lot of people tonight. But in any case, it just I really try to encourage people to think unconventionally about the Gulf of Mexico. First of all, it's not a regional sea; it's a continental sea. And it has historical and ecological connections to faraway places and events. And what happens upstream distantly upstream flows down to the Gulf of Mexico. For example, precious sediment that it comes to the Gulf of Mexico down rivers like the Mississippi and the Rio Grande, which are dammed and leveed, no longer flows like it should. And this is, the source of a natural regeneration of the coast and the Berry Islands. And two, I think we should think about the Gulf of Mexico historically, and both historically and think about how we got into the fix we are in today, because there's a history there. And no offense to my colleagues on the panel with me, but because they're as much in this cause as I am, but historically, engineers, architects, policymakers, the technocrats, the state, and I'll throw in a couple of historians, told us that we could live on the edge and gave us the means to do that, to live not just on the edge, but in harm's way. And today, sadly, I think that the philosophies and the permission to do that has really shaped the narrative in or around resilience and the design of resilience. And resilience is saying the same thing, that we can continue living on the edge. It's saying the same things that causeways and bridges and pier and beam foundations told us we once could. So I think that we need to think differently about resilience. I think we need to understand that sea level rise is not going to go away, that the coast is ephemeral, and that resilience, sadly, is forestalling the inevitable, and that is, of course, relocation. And we can either, by our own volition, relocate now, or we can, in the near future, be forced to relocate by sea level rise, geographic change, hydrological change. And thirdly, and I'll stop with this, I think we should, when we think about resilience, we should think about ecology. We should think about the non-human ecology. We should be thinking about that anyway, because our most effective defenses against what's happening around the coast, the American coast, not just the Gulf Coast, is the living shoreline. Mangroves and marshes and sandy and grassy beaches absorb the energy of waves. Concrete seawalls do not. They deflect that energy, the consequences of that energy to other places. And with the living shoreline, we have a win-win-win. They are, of course, birthplace and habitat. Estuaries are, of course, birthplace and habitat. They are buffers against intense weather, and they are fantastic carbon sinks. Acre for acre, they absorb more carbon than does a forest, or I don't like that term because that means commercial, a woodland. And so, and one more thing, if I may, finally, sorry, I'm rambling on. We also need to not forget about the root problem, and that is the need to reduce emissions, because if we don't, the planet will continue to heat up, and the weather will just turn more violent, and that violent weather will occur more frequently.
Thank you. Marlowe, you get to go next to talk about your understanding of resilience and sustainability. I might have known Jack was going to go down that road in advance. So
Somebody's got to.
Yeah,
I'm a voice in the wilderness here, sorry.
No.
I appreciate it. It tees me up perfectly. Yeah, I agree with all of that. I've also reported on living shorelines in the New York area, which is interesting. And again, that's what I mean by like connecting the dots, being able to report on living shorelines in the New York metropolitan area and see the parallels with Florida. I mean, that was the last thing I expected to see when I moved to New York for grad school and started reporting on some local issues. And so noticing those trends is interesting, not necessarily a good thing, but it is good because we can, communicate to readers things that they can learn from you can learn something from Florida that you can apply to another part of the world. And that's the thing that I try really hard to hone on in my reporting. But I'm going to give a different definition of resilience as a journalist, which is being as informed as possible. I think that's really what it comes down to. And that's, what my role is not allowing misinformation to hinder our progress, going forward, and being able to provide information to people that helps them make the decisions that are the most productive for our solutions. So when science, for example, is not reaching the policy level, that's where we start seeing our progress on climate change hindered, or at least that's what I've noticed in my reporting. And so that's where, to me, my personal role in communicating what resilience is informing people. And we see it in our wildlife communities too. I report on wildlife a lot. And my fellowship with the Safina Center is actually focused on how climate change affects human and wildlife communities on the coasts in tandem. And I've been able to work on a lot of different stories that touch on that theme. One fun example is this story about the Florida reef gecko down in the Miami area that I wrote for National Geographic, which is another good example because of resilience or lack of resilience, perhaps. One key concept to that story was how coastal squeeze, which is when sea level rise is coming in on one side and you've got human urban development on the other side, is narrowing the range that this species can live in. And in a weird way, that animal is so important to me, the Florida reef gecko. I keep that thing in my mind on every story I work on almost, because it's so emblematic of the challenges that we're facing as humans too. And I think we forget that a lot. So to me, those are the things that I'm keeping in mind, and that what we're looking at in ecology and in wildlife communities is sometimes we're overlooking that those are the same challenges that we are also facing. So being able to communicate those things so that people can make the decisions that they feel are best can do so.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to follow up? Then I'll get you next, Christine.
There is one thing I can add.
Oh, yeah,
if you don't mind, that I just
go.
remembered that you might be able to comment on.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to add one last thing. Sorry. So I'm doing what Jack did now. But when I was in Rhode Island earlier this year
What did I do?
just added another thought. I'm going to add another thought here. So I was in Rhode Island earlier this summer as a Metcalf Institute Fellow, which is with the University of Rhode Island. And we were there to learn specifically about coastal resilience and water quality issues, which is that was and still is a big focus of my journalism. And one of the things that stood out in my memory the most starkly was this community, this very wealthy community with a historic district, where their response to imminent sea level rise is to raise all of the buildings on these structures, these platforms, so that as the sea level rises, the water can flow through those structures and is not flooding those homes or those buildings. Not all of them, I think, are occupied by people who live there year round. And it really made me think a lot about what resilience actually is. Is that resilience, or is that a short-term adaptation or, adjustment to what we're seeing? And it bothered me that it was being proposed as a true climate change solution in that area, while there were other communities that do not have those resources, that were not receiving the plans or the funding to raise their homes. So what about all those other people, And even then, just raising homes, it's not necessarily a solution, because we're not working with all these interdisciplinary bodies to really truly adapt. That's just a short-term solution. I mean, the sea level is going to continue rising. So I just wanted to add that as an example of when we're thinking about resilience, what is it truly? Is it long-term or is it short-term? Because climate change is not going away anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay. Jeff?
So I think resilience to me, a resilient system is a system that can manage change in some way or another. It can manage change by rejecting it. It can manage it by getting out of the way, kind of like the buildings, and allows the water to come under, or it can manage it, by fully adapting and transforming, right? So it can sort of deal with it, it can adapt to it, or it can transform. And in all cases, I think the thing that I like to come back to is that in all of those ways of dealing with change, there's opportunity, right? Change presents an opportunity. You can take it, or you can pretend that it doesn't exist. So I like to think of resilience, or the challenges that we face, as presenting us with an opportunity to transform what we do, right? There's no perfect community in the world. There's no perfect house. There's no perfect anything. And so this change will present you with an opportunity. I mean, in some cases, I think we forget that and tend to overlook that and sort of want to stick with what we have, right? The historic community that's so bent on being exactly where it is that they're going to elevate a bunch of historic houses at extraordinary cost without maybe exploring different alternatives. So I would say, and this isn't, I think Jack and I probably say similar things that there's a different way of saying it, but I wouldn't say that living on the Florida coast is bad or wrong, or I don't know that I am in the position to judge whether someone lives here or not, but we do it in a terrible way. Like, we don't know how to do it. People have been living here for thousands and thousands of years. Did they build a concrete house at grade and expect it not to flood? No. And so I think there's an idea of living that is very modern. Modern in a historical modern, not necessarily futuristic, but that for the last 75 years, we've thought that we can sort of build a wall around everything we do and stay there, and that it'll never change. And that's fundamentally flawed. And so if you think about it, it's an extremely short window of time in Florida that we've actually decided to do that. And so how do we, given all of our technology and our ability to use concrete and AI and everything else, how do we actually start to think about a society that is adaptive and lightweight and moving and can occupy the coast, but doesn't have to be there all the time? It can be light on its feet, in a sense. So I think it's really important, because I love being on the coast. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to be here, and I think we all do. That's why we're all here. And so how do we not give that up? But at the same time, how do we not destroy it in the meantime?
Christine?
All right, I'll just add a couple of comments for this overall topic. One is just my reflections, having been a non-Florida resident, coming down and now experiencing several hurricanes. And that is that, like, my relationships with my whole community have been transformed by going through these events. Like, the strength of our neighborhood community is stronger because of our shared experience of going through these challenges together and then working together to come back from these events or share resources afterwards. You've got the neighbors that start texting you that you weren't friends with before, and all of a sudden you are. And sort of just transplant that to the Gulf Coast, which I've had the experience of going out after some of the hurricane, or in particular the Hurricane Idalia last year, to the Nature Coast and helping them clean up the lab out in Cedar Key. And the pace of coming back from the most recent storm this year was much faster. And the community is much more sort of nimble about how to both prepare and to come back. And so the general reflection here is that I think all of us are adapting to climate change all the time in our individual behaviors and in the interactions that we're having. So there is a resilience that is just occurring as a result of how we individually respond to events, whether it's the really hot days and all of a sudden you're using umbrellas for sun protection. And so I think there's like an individual component and a community component that, to Jeff's point, like, there's opportunities for a transition and translation and evolution that are really positive and can be really good things that you actually get something out of from a personal and a professional or a sort of a community perspective. That said, the scale of challenges are really enormous with regards to climate change and how intensively we've developed the landscape. And I think for the quality of life of people in coastal regions, the rubber hits the road with environmental degradation. Like the whole reason we go to the coast is to enjoy the coast, is to spend time on the beaches, is to have your, your viewscape, maybe of the back barrier islands, or go fishing with your kids or your best friends. And when the environment declines, our quality of life declines. And so from my perspective, I think we have this really interesting dichotomy of potentially increasing kind of different dimensions of social strength, although that's not exclusively true, especially under resource communities that are severely disrupted by these events. But massive problems, I think, with regards to the resilience and the sustainability of this region, that we have, out of control pollution issues that are driving environmental degradation and making those systems far less capable of withstanding extreme climate events. And so I'm not sure how to resolve all of that, but maybe that's the challenge of some of the students in the room.
Can I just add
Yeah, go
something
ahead,
real
Joe.
quick? I don't disagree with either one of you, and I share your perspective, and I appreciate it. My point is that your perspective is not the language of resilience. That's being controlled by the growth industry, because wherever you see a resilience plan up and down the American coast, you see construction cranes. Miami and Boston, St. Petersburg, Florida, and they're building as fast as ever before. And realtors in Miami, when their clients ask, they'll tell them, we've got the problem fixed. Engineers are taking care of it. We have a resilience plan. And then they sell you a condo that if it fell over, it would splash in Biscayne Bay.
Well, hopefully there won't be too much splashing in Biscayne Bay in the near future. But
I think it's already here.
yeah, I do too, honestly. I've got two last questions I'm going to ask, and these I'm going to throw to anyone who wants to answer them, and then I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A here in a few minutes. The first one is, I hinted at this earlier, as we think about the challenges facing our Gulf communities, how might we engage the communities while acknowledging the declining trust in institutions, such as declining trust in government, declining trust in higher education, declining trust in the media, and even declining trust in science itself too, right? So I'm going to leave that open. Any one of you can choose to engage on that. But how do we communicate effectively with communities within that environment of declining trust that is so prevalent today?
Just to tee us off, which is it's taking time to build the relationships. I mean, trust only comes when you have a reason to be trusted, and that there's a connection that's made, and that there's a sustaining of a relationship where, and there's an opportunity for reciprocity. And so I think that one thing it can be really challenging is how do you get into communities and spend enough time to build trusted relationships. And I think that forces a lot of us to think about how do you slow down in order to take the time to build those trusted relationships? How do you make sure you come back to them to ensure they get enriched? But there's always a personal sort of gratification that you get from building a new friend or a new relationship, that you learn from them and they learn from you. So I think from my perspective, it comes from slowing down and taking the time to identify individuals that you are going to build those relationships with, and investing in them, at least as a starting point.
That would also suggest returning to those communities as well, that it's not a one-time engagement, that there's a return and a continual engagement as well to build that trust and sustain it over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be an opportunity for a feedback, and I think the idea is that, especially as we're thinking about like the academic scholarship, this is like the Gulf Scholars Program, there's going to be various forms of research and community engagement that happens through this program. But I think the point is, like, how do we make sure that scholarship doesn't just serve the ivory tower of the main campus, but how does that scholarship go back and make sure that there's co-creation of it, and that there's a feedback that the outcomes of all the work that's generated, say, through this program meets the needs of local communities and it's actually being used. That's where we'll be most successful.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? Yeah, Marlowe.
I'll follow up on that because what you just said reminded me of something that's really important in the communication space, which is avoiding parachuting, avoiding parachute journalism. That's one thing that I'm very grateful that much of the journalism school here at UF really hammered home on for students, and it's stuck with me for the better and has given me tools to avoid parachute journalism in my own work. But I think, I'm speaking to the journalism and communication space specifically, but not just popping into that community, reporting on it, and then leaving forever. Really forging relationships with those sources, following up with them. If you're reporting on the effects of a hurricane in Cedar Key, for example, and you're talking to people and asking them, what they're struggling with and what sort of things they'd like to see going forward for resiliency, let's say, follow up on that story, or even just follow up with that source. I have a source in Cedar Key who I text every time there's a hurricane coming because I'm so, I just care about him, and I want him to know that I know that he's there and preparing for that hurricane. And I think sometimes in journalism there's this, you don't want to get too close to your sources thing, and that there's a line though between that, and it's different. There's a difference between caring about sources as humans and getting too close to them where it's influencing your reporting. I think those are two very different things. But another thing that I wanted to note was the importance of including and uplifting the voices of those people in those communities that are the most vulnerable, and making sure that they are not only heard, but that you're keeping in mind who you're writing for. Keeping in mind who are the people that are reading this and what are you giving them. Because if you're not giving them anything useful with the information that you're gathering, that can be a problem, and that can also stall progress on climate change and resilience and all the things that we've been talking about. So those are two things that I wanted to add to that.
Jeff or Jack? Yeah, Jack, go ahead.
I just want to piggyback on what Marlowe had to say. I think story is very important, and telling stories, but you tell stories about the local people. And as you said, let their voices be heard. You tell stories about their experiences. I think that's a way to win trust when you are, you immerse yourself in the community and look at it from the inside out. And of course, story is our original form of passing knowledge along to others, telling stories, I should say. And of course, that's what journalists do. Some historians do, and I find that very important in my work, and something that is a natural for the humanities, and that's how the humanities can fit into this program and this cause we're all concerned about.
Yeah, excellent. I want to highlight a couple things here. One other piece, and this is when we think about Gulf Scholars Program and the Graham Center's participation in it, one of the things that I think about a lot is how do we engage with communities by understanding them where they are. And I don't mean just their physical location, but I also mean as a community, what defines that community? Because sometimes location isn't the only thing that defines it. If you have a community that's struggling with the loss of its fishing economy, that's a real loss that's impacting individuals' day-to-day lives, but it's also impacting the life and the livelihood of a community as a whole too, right? So understanding that, it doesn't do a whole lot of good and to go in and tell them, oh, well, you've got to find some other way, to make your living. They know that already, right? You've got to try to understand what does that mean from a community perspective, not just a paycheck perspective, right? So that's a critical piece there. The other thing we've been talking a lot about is community, and I'm going to, this is not to set up another question, but I also want to make clear when we think about Gulf communities, we need to think in some different levels about them. So in a very strict sense, you might think of a Gulf community as a community that is physically located on the Gulf, right? So you could take St. Pete, you could take, Tampa, you could take, a bunch of different places as physically located on the Gulf. That's great. Those are important to understand as physically located on the Gulf. If you use the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's definition, every Florida community is a Gulf community. Every Florida community is a Gulf community. If you take Jack Davis's definition that he articulated a little bit here and maybe a little bit more from his book, our beautiful white sandy panhandle beaches are, erosion from the Appalachian Mountains. If you take the distance from, Key West to Pensacola, it's almost the same as Pensacola to Chicago. So the middle 2/3 of the United States are Gulf communities in some sense as well. We've got those connections that we want to make sure that when we talk about how we engage communities, we need to have a good understanding of what types of communities are we talking about here as well. The last question before, and I'll throw this out to all of you. Again, this is a launching event for the Gulf Scholars Program, which is meant to engage undergraduates. So what are some spaces that you think are ripe for student engagement for students who are here now, or potentially for what they might do, soon after being students, which is to say after they graduate and they're looking for a next step if they're interested in Gulf engagement? Where are those spaces that you see opportunity, need, demand, however you want to phrase it in your own spaces? Again, I'll throw that open to any of you to try to address.
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
So there are journalism students in the room, right? Can I see like a show of hands for journalism students? Yay.
Yeah,
Okay,
great,
awesome.
excellent.
Just want to make sure I've got the right audience here. So yeah, I think like speaking for journalism and journalism students or anybody who's interested in communication, because there's scientists who can also do communication. That's something that we need more of. I think taking advantage of opportunities to do reporting on these issues, whether you feel like there's a focus on it or not. Like when I was a student here, I kind of focused just on environmental journalism. I decided very early on that that's the thing that I wanted to pursue. And so in classes that were not specifically environmental journalism, I was still writing on the beat. And that really helped me, again, cultivate those sources, cultivate relationships with different communities. A couple of examples that came to mind that I just wanted to share were, when I was a student in a multimedia reporting class, I went out to Cedar Key with said fisherman friend, Captain Voiles, give him a little shout out. I went fishing with him and some clients to see if he was catching any snook, because there was a paper that came out from the Nature Coast Biological Station out there showing that snook were moving northward in the Gulf of Mexico because the water is now warm enough for them to survive there. Another story that remains strong in my memory as I'm going forward with my reporting. And that was an example of an effective climate change where actually, that recreational fisherman was able to provide something new to his clients while also communicating what's happening in the local ecosystem, which I thought was really cool. But then on the flip side, there was a different story that I had reported for Fresh Take Florida here, our local news service, about the stone crab industry, and talk about communities, just to touch on that real quick. That was a story where there was a 5-week proposed cut to the stone crab season, and the entire state's stone crab industry was up in arms. I mean, I was talking to some very angry people on very long phone calls, accusing the scientists responsible for this decision of faulty science. So that was really tricky in terms of my job was to make murky water clear and try to communicate what was actually happening, and while also making sure that fishing community, I was talking to people from down in the Keys to Southwest Florida, and it was really important for me to be able to establish the trust with them, to say, listen, I hear you, and I know that this is affecting your livelihoods really in a really potentially disastrous way, and you're upset about it, and hopefully the information I was able to convey reached, both sides of that, communicated some science while making sure that those communities felt heard. And yeah, again, just on the taking advantage of opportunities for students, note, when I first started as a student here, the Alligator, the Independent Florida Alligator, our student newspaper here, did not have any sort of science section. It was something that I proposed and they did not listen to me. But when COVID hit, all of a sudden we have a science section now in the paper, which is awesome. I'm so glad that there was a turning point that initiated that. So for anybody who is interested in pursuing science communication in some form, that's another great way to get involved and practice talking to people and distilling information, really complex information, into simple terms that your readers can understand.
Jeff, you looked like you were going to jump in there too.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I would say, to jump back from the meet people where they're at conversation, I think that, yeah, absolutely, we need to meet people where they're at, but it occurred to me that we can also, but we shouldn't stay there in a sense, right? People who come to you as an expert, as someone with some training in some field, they're not looking for you to tell them what they already, you said this, they're not looking for you to tell them what they already know. And so we have to be creative. We have to always be creative. And I think as an architect, it's just ingrained in me to both solve the problem, but then also to dream about something that maybe I don't have the answer to. And so, I think in all of the fields that are facing this challenge, these are problems that it's not the same problem that we had last year or the year before, It is in many cases, it is a radically new problem. Temperatures that we've never seen before, water moving into places it hasn't been in 12,000 years. Things that we're just unaccustomed to. So we have to get outside the box. And I think that requires creative thinking. It requires us to be willing to take risks on ideas. It also requires us not to fall into our own disciplinary tracks and be like, okay, well, this is what I know, I'll solve that problem. We have to communicate with all of the different fields. And so whenever you have that opportunity to branch out and to go and talk to the anthropologist or the scientist or it's really, I think that's just really essential. And more the fields, the chief resilience officer or the person in my field who works at a firm where there's deliberately a lot of different professionals in that office. That is more and more the way firms work these days. And I think that's a really, really good thing for you all to consider and to kind of embrace.
Man, I think that there's space for our students and graduates in Gulf Humanities. We need artists, songwriters, musicians. We need fiction writers, long and short fiction. We need literary nonfiction writers. I think about the impact that John D. MacDonald, who set virtually most of his books, 72 fiction, his novels, his crime fiction novels in Florida. And I think of the impact that just a couple of them have had that were both set in the Gulf of Mexico, led to the creation of the Save Our Bays groups, SOBs, and I think about the impact of the Mississippi artist Walter Anderson, profound. If you ever on the Mississippi coast, which is really a beautiful place, beyond the casinos. I highly recommend going to the Walter Anderson Museum in Ocean Springs. You walk into this place, and it's just a really magical world. And that's how we saw and he painted the Gulf of Mexico.
And if I can add to that, and this connects back to Bob Graham a little bit as well, a perfect embodiment of that is the relationship that Bob Graham had with Jimmy Buffett, right? And Buffett's ability through music to create an image of Florida, right? But they worked together on the Save the Manatees initiative.
Big parrot head right here.
So that's, again, a real-world demonstration of the point that you're making, that sometimes the cultural icon who conveys such an image of Florida becomes the vehicle for a real policy initiative, too. Yeah, Christine?
Yeah, so I think, what I hear from my students all the time is a desire for impact. And this program is a great opportunity to go to communities that are experiencing real problems and go learn those problems, go be a part of those solutions, and, start your career in the way that Marlowe did. That launches you into something really interesting and that you're really passionate about. So I generally see this as a vehicle of connecting you to impact, and whether it's through all these different arms, go have impact. With that said, some areas of impact that I think are needed in this area is connecting economic implications and economic change to environmental change and to social change. The economic piece of all of this has a huge power over decision making, and so we don't have the economist or the representative from maybe the business school on this panel, but I think that's something we have to understand the economics of these different adaptation solutions, and also some of the connections between environmental change and health. our health and our well-being as Floridians. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to dig into those types of intersections, but encourage you to go out there and dig deep and go make some amazing discoveries.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to open you up for questions here, and as we're getting ready to do that, I want to mention one thing. If you are a student and you're looking for a direct way to engage, we will be launching the Gulf Scholars, not quite as a certificate yet, but as a medallion program that will be open for enrollment. Also in the end of February, the weekend that bridges the end of February, beginning of March, we have our Future of Florida Policy Summit. Every year, this year it is focused on the Gulf, and so you'll be able to apply to participate in that. We'll have approximately 70 students, about half of whom are UF students, about half of whom come from other parts of the state, other institutions of higher ed in the state, for a weekend policy summit focused on the Gulf. And again, that will be open application. We cover the cost of food, we cover the cost of all the speakers, and all that kind of stuff. So again, if you're an undergraduate interested in that, look for the Future of Florida Policy Summit. Happy to open it up for questions. We've got the Mentimeter. Again, you can submit through that. We also will have a where are the microphones here? We've got microphones back there that we can, Cole's got one over here. If you want to put your hand up. We've got a question in the back, one over here. Yeah, so Cole, if you'll start circulating with the mic.
Hi, my name is Kayla. I just want to start by thanking you all for giving us your time today. I think I speak for everyone when I say this talk has been so helpful. So I had a question, but your last point about the economics really piqued my interest. So I know someone else mentioned something about you're fighting against builders and they want to keep on going with development because that makes them money. So as people who are interested in environmental and helping the people, what are kind of solutions that you've seen that have these positive economic implications that aren't like 10, 20 years in the future, and kind of how do you propose that to policymakers, or when you're trying to develop these solutions, how do you propose them in a way that's both economically beneficial and also beneficial for the people?
I'm not sure how to answer all of that question, but I'll start with one thing, which is what it made me think of is in the city of Sarasota, they were experiencing poor water quality in the bay, and to fix that problem is huge investments in upgrading their wastewater infrastructure, $150 million in various kind of infrastructure upgrades for that community. But they're able to tell the story of what are the economic benefits of making these investments, that literally the values of your properties, the sort of the vibrance of the boating community, the fishing community in this entire region are worth this investment. And so, they were able to get the county commissioners on board. And now Sarasota Bay is one of the few success stories in the state where water quality is actually getting better, that seagrasses are coming back. And so I guess some of the point is that I think there is storytelling to be told about why some of these investments are going to achieve an even greater return on investment. And that there's real consequences to basically sitting on our hands and waiting. So now Sarasota Bay is able to kind of brag about that they're a region that has taken they're proud of it. And I think that's actually, can reinforce things like property values and reinvestment in those types of communities. So I'll just leave it with that for now.
I'll jump in. I actually was just at a conference about 3 hours ago about residential home building. And very interesting, one of the talks, her name was Chris Height, and she has a group called the Outside Collaborative. And what they've done is transform the way big developers deal with landscape and water issues. And some of these points were kind of shocking, that someone who buys a $300,000 house, a starter house, it seems like, is paying something like $800 a month in water to water their lawn. I mean, the amount of water people pour on their yard is unbelievable, and it costs a lot of money for someone who's barely able to pay the mortgage. And so they've been able to cut that into like a quarter, like 25% consumption, just by using natural systems and going back to the Florida landscape. It is not easy to fight those fights. I mean, and that is a drag out battle with developers. And there were some of them in the room, and they were highly suspect, and they they said this was really hard to do, because their bottom line was taking the hit on that. But at the end of the day, it is progress, and I would say it's uphill battle. But I do think that it was heartening to hear someone fighting that fight and actually making a substantial difference. And so there are examples like that. Granted, there's a lot of bad examples too, right? And probably most of it, but they're out there.
We do have a question that came in through Mentimeter. I know I guess the screen's back. When communicating with a community, how do you structure information? How do you balance story and facts? So
That sounds like a question for me.
and maybe Jack too.
Yeah. Balance. I mean, the question was communicating with. Can you repeat it one more time?
When communicating with a community, how do you structure information? How do you balance story and facts?
Yeah, I feel like in my mind, those are two different things. There's communicating with communities. How do you present information to them? I mean, as a journalist, I think making sure that the folks that you're talking to in the communities that you are reporting on are aware of what you're reporting on. There are examples out there. I don't have any personal examples, but there are examples out there of communities hearing about something happening for the first time from a journalist. That can be a good thing because at least they know about that thing is happening now. So I think making sure that communities feel informed ahead of you having a conversation about the challenges ahead of them that you are writing about or communicating to a wider audience. And then balancing fact and story is super important and is a constant challenge for any storyteller or communicator. I think, thinking about, again, who you're writing for and what are the most interesting parts of the story that you're telling, keeping that in mind, and not in a gotcha way, but like, what is the compelling thing that's going to connect with my readers? And starting there often is helpful. And then making sure that the facts that you're including are selective and that you're not just info dumping on people, and giving them everything. Give them the things that they need to know specifically, and weave it into your storytelling that way. That would be my way. But Jack, do you have additional?
No, other than I would say that, stories are a narrative home for facts, and but details and also new questions as well. But, and I'd agree with you. Cynthia and Barnett and I talk about this a lot and have been doing for years. And, every word, and you were trained in this way, every word you put down on the page, you have to give consideration to your audience. You have to know, as you said, who that audience is, and ensure that you are connecting with them through your story or through your words.
Other questions? Yeah, over here.
Hi, sorry. I'm Kate. Thank you guys for being here tonight. I grew up in Gainesville, so this really hits home. This question is directed kind of at Marlowe, but for everybody. So like with the data that Dr. Angelini and her team collects, and they come up with these ideas for initiatives that could create change on the legislative level, how would you articulate that information on a smaller scale in communities that have lower socioeconomic status and lower education levels to get them to understand the information, but accurately and in a clear way? Like some people can't read that well. So how would you disseminate information that is, accessible to everybody?
That's a great question and something that I think the wider journalism industry needs to be thinking about more often. So thank you so much for asking that and calling attention to it. With the example that I provided about the story that I wrote about Christine's work, that was definitely for an audience that can, visually look at this graphic that I created with my colleague Alex Harris. She did all the visualization parts, so I want to give credit to her on that. That was definitely for an audience that at least can see that and I think even for folks who don't have any of a science background, it was helpful to see, we kind of used intensity of colors and size of circles to indicate where these blooms were happening more severely and more frequently, as a way to kind of reach readers who have no science background. But what you're talking about with vulnerable communities or communities that might not have the resources to understand even, a complex news story. I think we should be thinking more about visual and other interactive or multimedia ways. I mean, the multimedia journalism landscape does not get enough love, and I think that's where we have an opportunity to connect with people on a more local and intimate level. I mean, documentary work, photography, short form videos, infographics. Those are all ways that we can reach those communities in a better way. And I think there's so much opportunity for better collaboration on that front that is not being taken advantage of because of like the bureaucracy of certain media structures. Honestly, I'll be the first person to call that out. I would love if as a freelancer too, it can be difficult to foster those collaborations and to suggest packages to outlets. And I think there needs to be some way of making that more intuitive. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
I have a comment, which is we did this project in the Peace River Basin, which drains from around Orlando down to the northern part of Charlotte Harbor around Punta Gorda in Southwest Florida. And we worked with the Center for Public Interest Communications to sort of understand where different user groups get information from. And basically, the voice matters of this material, like who you're getting your information from, because different people have different trusted voices that they get their insights from based on who they relate to, who they, have a shared background from. So, the ag community is not going to hear from the Department of Environmental Protection in a way and hear anything that's trusted from them. And, the downstream advocacy groups that are really mad at upstream mining, like they have their circles of where they get information. And so one of the things that was, I think, really important that we learned from that project is like, how do we basically get these different science messages connected to key communicators, to those groups that you want to communicate in formats that they can essentially adopt it. And that's a lot more work than us usually like dropping a paper and then, having a little press release. Like there's a whole other cascade, I think, of an operation that's needed to support that type of communication enterprise.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add to that reminds me, I should have mentioned that's why local embedded journalism is so important. Our local newsrooms do not get enough love either, and there needs to be, I think more attention afforded and more resources and funding afforded toward those newsrooms, because they're the ones who are getting to those communities first and foremost and connecting with them the most and earning their trust. Someone who's in a very affected community and in a place that, is facing a set of challenges that, they're not going to the New York Times to read about the issues that like they themselves are facing. It's the local newsrooms that are really doing the best groundwork, I think. So.
And unfortunately, the news deserts that are emerging as those local news organizations continue to disappear as well. We have one more question on Mentimeter, and this will be the last question because we do want to get upstairs for our reception. How do you see, and I think this is for Christine and Jeff primarily, how do you see landscape architecture and environmental engineering intersecting to create nature-based solutions? What are some examples where this collaboration has been effective?
So for motivating the public to want to outplant a marsh or an oyster reef along a shoreline, when there's homes and there's critical community infrastructure behind them, requires a lot of convincing, because people see a wall built. That's typically what we go to, and it feels somewhat comforting to see sort of, I think, hard infrastructure potentially built. I think this is our default, at least over the last 75 years, is to go with the hard infrastructure solutions. So I feel like there's
Don't forget more air conditioning.
Yeah. So
Right?
Jeff, I'll probably be demeaning your whole field by saying that there's a storytelling aspect that the architects provide by generating these really compelling ways of visualizing what these different future scenarios can look like and being able to kind of tell some of the visual stories. The engineers never make pretty presentations, graphics, any kind of communication materials. And so working with those that have a design aspect and a design lens where they're thinking about the customer as the community engagement in a very different way than the engineers do, I found that to be really powerful. So we've our projects we've done around Air Force bases and things like that, the storytelling component and motivating local actors to get on board is that door opens when we have architects and landscape architects on board.
I think the uphill battle is underappreciated because things are legislated and legislated and legislated, and the Corps of Engineers is the one that comes to my mind, is that their job and their boundary is to protect navigation for the shipping industry. And so at the end of the day, the Corps is almost barred from using nature-based solutions unless they're somehow improving navigation. I mean, and that's not exactly the way it falls out, but in Louisiana, there was a lot of it was like, why do you have to build walls everywhere? Why do we have to do that? And they're like, we can't do anything else. And so the challenges there are huge. So engineering with nature is one of these opportunities that's emerged in engineering to really start to challenge some of those approaches. And that's a partnership of engineers and landscape architects and ecologists to try to break down some of the Corps of Engineers' sort of hard and fast kind of rules. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of good examples in the last 10, 15 years of this really emerging. So, after Hurricane Sandy, there was the Rebuild by Design efforts in New York. Resiliency by Design in the San Francisco Bay Area was a big competition to sort of explore that. In Louisiana, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority's Coastal Master Plan is a $50 billion project to reincorporate the Mississippi River as the builder of the landscape. So, I mean, you could wrap your mind around it. It was thousands of years of doing that until the Corps came in and built a bunch of levees, and then over the last 75 years, the entire landscape has almost disappeared. But reestablishing those systems is very difficult when communities live behind those levees. So there's a lot of really great examples out there, but it's a hard challenge.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to add that I think it starts with us, all of us. I mean, every homeowner, has a responsibility, I believe, with their landscaped or their manicured lawn to rethink it. Almost 50% of the potable water in Florida goes down on lawns to keep grasses green. And rewilding yards has become increasingly popular. All you need is an example or two in your neighborhood, and others follow. I rewilded my yard in the duck pond years ago, and I have strangers come knock on my door, and they ask me, who did this for you? Because they're interested in doing it as well. So I think the responsibility really begins with each of us. And it's not just the big institutions. I have no love interest in the Army Corps of Engineers, believe me.
Well, on that note, love interest aside, right? So I think that provides a good space to wrap up. I want to just make one final point that I think came across from a lot of the different responses that we heard from our wonderful panelists tonight, and that is that there's a real space for imagination, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're coming from what you might perceive as a real technical discipline, or you might perceive it as a traditional STEM discipline, or you might perceive as the humanities and trying, across the board, there's a real space for imagination and creative thinking and trying to imagine what to this point has maybe seemed unimaginable, right? And so, again, going back to this notion of sort of the last 75 years and the gecko being pinched between sea and people, you might think about that, and this is something that Christine and Jeff and Jack and I have been thinking a lot about. The interstate corridors, which are the symbol, if you will, and the avenue for huge demographic growth and compression of our coastlines from one side, and then the compression of the coastline through climate change and storms and everything. How do you imagine a different future for that, right? And the person who wants to write the next great American novel might be able to envision that, or write the next great American song, or do the next big data project, the digital twin to envision something different as well, right? So that space for imagination. Don't underestimate the value of creativity, right? And where you might be able to apply that. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I'd like all of us to thank our panelists very much. And again, we do have a reception upstairs in the O'Neill Reading Room. Please feel free to join us. Thank you all.
And thank you, Matt.